July 1942. The northern edge of the Pacific lay under a ceiling of endless fog. Wind swept through the Aleutian chain, carrying the smell of salt and cold iron. Inside a patrolling PBY Catalina flying boat, machinist's mate Albert Knack steadied his binoculars against the vibration of the engines. Below, something glimmered through the mist, a pale shape half buried in marshland. At first it looked like a piece of wreckage, but then he saw it clearly, red circles on white wings. The emblem of the rising sun. A Japanese Zero fighter, upside down in the grass, perfectly recognizable even from altitude. Knack froze. For months, every pilot in the Pacific had heard the same stories. The Zero was unstoppable. It climbed faster, turned tighter, and seemed to break every rule of physics known to American engineers. Yet there it was, lying helpless and silent in a swamp on a remote Alaskan island. Lieutenant William Thies, the Catalina's pilot, circled lower to confirm. The landscape below was ghostly. Wet fields, thin streams, and one impossible sight that would change everything about how the US fought the air war. They marked the position carefully on their charts. None of the crew yet understood that they had just found one of the most valuable prizes of World War II, an aircraft that would teach its enemies how to defeat it. At that moment, they only felt disbelief. How could a machine that had terrorized the Pacific lie here, almost intact? No fire, no signs of battle, just silence. To understand the shock, it's important to remember what the Zero meant in 1942. Since Pearl Harbor, Allied pilots had faced it again and again, and almost always lost. Over the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and the Coral Sea, the Japanese fighter danced through the sky with impossible agility. Pilots described it as fighting smoke, one instant behind you, the next above. Reports came back filled with the same advice: do not dogfight. Every attempt to outturn a Zero ended the same way, with aircraft disappearing into the ocean. It seemed the Japanese had created something supernatural. How could an island nation, believed to lag in aviation technology, build a carrier fighter that outperformed everything America and Britain could field? The fear wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Every encounter reinforced the legend: the Zero could not be matched. Now, as the Catalina circled above Akatan Island, that myth lay overturned, literally. The crew decided to return to base and report. Visibility was worsening. Fog rolled in thicker by the minute. On the flight back, Knack kept glancing at the notes he'd taken. If what they saw was real, it meant the impossible had finally become tangible. Somewhere down there, resting quietly in an Alaskan marsh, was the secret the Pacific needed. The next morning, under a rare patch of clear weather, Lieutenant Thies returned with a small landing team. The island was desolate, windswept, silent except for seabirds. They followed the coordinates, moving through tall wet grass until they saw it, a gleaming shape half sunken in mud. Even upside down, the Zero looked predatory. Its smooth wings reflected the morning light, the red insignia vivid against the silver body. Time seemed to stop as they approached. No one spoke. The aircraft that had ruled the skies lay here like a sleeping animal. The landing party circled slowly, rifles ready but unused. Closer inspection showed the cockpit glass cracked but clear, the fuselage mostly intact. The plane had flipped on landing yet hadn't disintegrated. That alone astonished them. Japanese machines were supposed to be fragile, but this one had endured an impact that would have torn others apart. Chief Aviation Pilot William Scarborough stepped forward. He knelt beside the inverted canopy and looked inside. The instruments were frozen mid-reading, gauges still legible, labels in neat Japanese script. Scarborough felt a strange mix of awe and curiosity. For the first time, an American could study the fighter that had dominated their skies. What he didn't yet realize was that the greatest revelation wasn't hidden in the engine or the guns. It was in what the aircraft didn't have. They photographed every detail, marking damage points and construction joints. As they worked, the island silence made the moment feel almost sacred. When the documentation was complete, the recovery crew prepared to move the aircraft. It was light, surprisingly so. Even half filled with water and mud, 6 men could shift it by hand. "It feels wrong," one of them murmured. "Something this deadly shouldn't weigh like that." They didn't know it yet, but that strange lightness would explain everything. When the inspection began, the men expected to find armor plates, heavy steel frames, and layers of reinforced glass. Instead, what they found felt almost unbelievable. The Zero's metal skin was so thin that a light tap produced a hollow, tin-like sound. The cockpit seat was barely more than a metal frame with a thin cushion. Behind it, no protective bulkhead, no steel plate, nothing to shield the pilot from incoming fire. Scarborough ran his gloved hand along the fuselage, half expecting to find hidden reinforcement. There was none. The fuel tanks looked like plain aluminum containers, unprotected by any self-sealing layer. In American aircraft, such tanks were made with special rubber linings that expanded when pierced, sealing holes and preventing fires. The Zero had none of it. The men exchanged uneasy glances. For months they had imagined the Japanese fighter as a machine of mystery, a technological marvel from an unknown world. Yet what they were seeing contradicted everything they had believed. The Zero's terrifying performance didn't come from advanced technology. It came from sacrifice. Every ounce of weight had been stripped away, every safety measure removed in pursuit of one goal: speed and agility. It was a shocking paradox. The plane that had dominated the Pacific skies owed its success not to invulnerability, but to fragility. It could turn faster and climb higher only because its pilots flew in machines that offered no protection at all. Recovering the aircraft, however, proved far harder than examining it. The marshy terrain clung to its landing gear like glue. The first recovery attempt failed when the weather turned violent. Aleutian fog and wind struck suddenly, forcing the team back to the shore. 2 more tries followed before they finally managed to free the fighter. They built a crude wooden sled beneath it, dragging the Zero inch by inch toward the beach. Even soaked and caked in mud, the plane felt astonishingly light. On July 15th, after days of exhausting effort, the wreck was loaded aboard a barge and taken to the USS St. Mihiel, which carried it south to Seattle. There, the Zero would be transferred again, this time to a naval air station in San Diego, where engineers and test pilots would try to restore it to flying condition. The trip took nearly a month, and by the time it arrived, rumors had already spread through the ranks. Mechanics, designers, even admirals wanted to see the legendary aircraft that had defied them for so long. When it finally reached North Island Naval Air Station, it was placed under 24-hour guard. Not to protect it from sabotage, but from curiosity. Everyone wanted a piece of it, a bolt, a panel, even a rivet, as a souvenir. To most of them, the Zero wasn't just an airplane, it was the embodiment of the enemy's power. Now that it sat silent on American soil, the mystery seemed ready to be solved. The repair crews began their work with skepticism. Wartime propaganda had long portrayed Japanese manufacturing as crude and inferior. Many expected to find shoddy construction or copied Western designs. Instead, they uncovered something that demanded respect. The Zero was exquisitely built, but with a purpose entirely different from their own aircraft. Every component had been engineered for minimum weight. The internal spars were made of a rare aluminum alloy, strong, light, and sophisticated. Even the smallest fittings showed careful craftsmanship. As the restoration progressed, the aircraft's philosophy became clearer. Its wings were permanently bonded to the fuselage, saving the heavy bolts used in American designs. The rear section detached neatly behind the cockpit for maintenance, keeping the front as light as possible. The control surfaces were covered with fabric instead of metal. Another ounce saved here, another there. The cockpit canopy was simple and narrow, offering excellent visibility but no armor. Piece by piece, the Zero was coming back to life, not as a myth, but as a lesson in design. The mechanics couldn't stop talking about it. "It's a racehorse," one said, "beautiful but delicate." Another added, "They built it to fly like lightning, not to last." By August, the Zero stood on the tarmac again, its silver skin gleaming in the California sun. For the first time, Americans could walk around the plane that had haunted their skies for 7 months. It looked almost peaceful now, sleek, elegant, and silent. Yet everyone who looked at it felt the same question forming in their minds. How could something so light, so fragile, dominate so completely? The answer would come soon, when the Zero took off again, this time flown by an American test pilot. September 20th, 1942. The sun over California shimmered in the morning haze as Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders climbed into the cockpit of the newly repaired Zero. The aircraft looked pristine again, polished aluminum reflecting the hangar lights, red insignias repainted for authenticity. But Sanders wasn't thinking about appearances. His job was simple: find out exactly what made this aircraft so dangerous and what could defeat it. Sanders was one of the Navy's most experienced test pilots. Calm, methodical, and precise, he had flown nearly every American fighter in service. Yet even he felt a flicker of unease as he sat down in the small, cramped seat. The cockpit was shockingly tight. The controls were delicate, the walls close. "Feels like putting on a glove," he muttered over the radio. The engine, a Nakajima Sakai 14-cylinder radial, started with a smooth purr. Mechanics stepped back as the propeller blurred into motion. The plane rolled forward easily. The narrow landing gear made it wobble slightly, but Sanders kept it steady. Then, with a gentle pull of the throttle, the Zero leapt from the runway. It felt alive. Almost immediately, he noticed the difference. American fighters felt solid, heavy, muscular. The Zero felt like air itself. The control stick responded instantly, requiring only a touch to bank or climb. "It's strange," Sanders reported. "You think, and it moves." At 5,000 feet, he began testing its limits, gentle turns, rolls, and climbs. The responsiveness was astonishing. It could pivot inside its own radius, almost defying physics. No wonder American pilots couldn't outturn it. It wasn't just maneuverable, it was graceful. The aircraft seemed to anticipate motion before Sanders even finished commanding it. Then came the next test, high-speed handling. At 200 knots, the Zero still responded well. At 250, something changed. The control stick grew stiff. The ailerons, which controlled roll, began resisting movement. Sanders applied more force. Trying to roll right, it was sluggish. Rolling left felt smoother, easier. The asymmetry intrigued him. It wasn't fatal, but in combat, that detail could mean survival. He made a note. Zero prefers to roll left. Slow to the right above 200 knots. That one line would soon save countless pilots. Next came the dive test. Sanders pointed the nose downward, accelerating rapidly. The wind roared louder, instruments rattled. Then suddenly, the engine coughed and went silent. The propeller spun uselessly. Sanders's heart skipped. He was gliding. He leveled out, coaxed the throttle, and the engine sputtered back to life. He repeated the maneuver. Again, under negative G-force, the engine died. The reason became clear. The Zero used a float-type carburetor that relied on gravity-fed fuel flow. When inverted or under negative acceleration, fuel simply stopped reaching the engine. That discovery was revolutionary. Back on the ground, Sanders wrote his report immediately. When under pursuit by a Zero, he explained, dive sharply and push forward on the stick. Negative acceleration will cut its engine. It cannot follow. It was the breakthrough everyone had hoped for. The Zero's secret wasn't invincibility. It was vulnerability hidden behind agility. For the first time, the United States had a tactic that could counter it, not by matching its movements, but by exploiting its design flaws. Over the following weeks, Sanders flew 24 test missions. Each revealed new insights. At low speeds, the Zero dominated. It could turn tighter than any Allied aircraft. But at higher speeds, its structure flexed, its control surfaces stiffened, and its maneuverability vanished. The lightweight frame that made it so agile at 150 miles per hour betrayed it at 300. The faster it went, the more it struggled. This was the critical balance Japanese engineers had struck, an airplane built for close, slow combat, excelling in turn fights but falling apart in high-speed engagements. American fighters like the F-4F Wildcat and the P-40 Warhawk were heavier and less nimble, but they were stronger. They could dive faster, absorb hits, and survive maneuvers that would destroy the Zero. With each test, the myth unraveled. The Zero was not a miracle weapon. It was a fragile masterpiece, extraordinary in its narrow domain, fatally flawed outside it. By October, every pilot in the Pacific received the new tactical briefing. It included simple instructions. Never turn with a Zero. Never fight its fight. Use your superior speed, dive away, and climb back for another pass. These boom and zoom tactics transformed the air war overnight. But the true effect went deeper. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots had hope. They weren't running anymore. They were learning how to fight and win. The Akutan Zero, as it came to be known, had done what no intelligence report or radar system could. It had shown the enemy's limits. And from that moment on, the skies of the Pacific would never be the same again. By late October 1942, copies of the Zero's test reports began circulating through every U.S. Navy and Marine Corps air unit in the Pacific. Pilots pored over the documents with fascination and disbelief. For months, they had faced an enemy aircraft that seemed untouchable. Now, at last, there were answers and tactics. At first glance, the report looked technical: tables of speeds, climb rates, roll tendencies, and wing loading. But in between those numbers lay the keys to survival. The document's most important section was simple and direct. Do not engage a Zero in a turning fight. Use diving attacks. Maintain high speed. Apply negative acceleration when pursued. To the men reading it on distant islands and aircraft carriers, these lines were like a revelation. Pilots who had watched friends disappear into clouds of smoke suddenly understood why. It wasn't lack of skill or courage. It was physics. The Zero's light frame and float carburetor doomed it under the right conditions. In the ready rooms of carriers like the Enterprise and the Hornet, instructors rewrote their briefings overnight. Chalkboards filled with diagrams of the Thatch weave, a tactic invented months earlier but now fully validated. Two fighters would fly side by side, weaving toward each other whenever attacked. The Zero, forced to follow one target, would drift into the sights of the other. Every squadron practiced the maneuver until it became instinct. Simulated dogfights turned into science lessons. Pilots learned to exploit the Zero's weaknesses deliberately, to dive, to roll right when it tried to follow left, to bait it into steep climbs that drained its energy. For the first time, Allied flyers weren't fighting blind. The change in morale was immediate. "It's not magic anymore," one Marine pilot wrote in his diary. "It bleeds like anything else." Soon, these lessons reached the front lines: Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands. The first combat tests came quickly. A pair of Marine F-4F Wildcats flying over Henderson Field spotted two Zeros at higher altitude. The Americans should have been doomed. The Zeros dove first, attacking from above. But instead of turning, the Marines pushed their sticks forward, diving hard. The Zeros followed, and both engines stalled. For seconds they were gliders, and in those seconds, the Americans reversed and fired. One Zero caught flame, the other fled. Word spread like wildfire. Every pilot in the region heard the story within days. The unstoppable enemy wasn't unstoppable anymore. Back in California, engineers continued dissecting the Akatan Zero piece by piece. Its structure told a story not only of technology but of philosophy. Where American designers saw safety, the Japanese saw weight. Where Americans installed armor, the Japanese installed range. Every gram mattered. That trade-off had created an aircraft that was brilliant for offense but disastrous for endurance. To the American engineers, this realization was like reading an enemy's mind. They began comparing notes with Grumman, the company already developing the F-6F Hellcat, the Wildcat's replacement. Some of the new fighters' design decisions now seemed prophetic. The Hellcat had thicker skin, heavier armor, and a massive engine capable of overpowering the Zero in a climb. The captured Zero validated everything about that approach. Meanwhile, test pilot Eddie Sanders continued his flights, now pairing the Zero against American fighters in mock dogfights. The results were filmed, analyzed frame by frame. Against the Wildcat, the Zero dominated in low-speed turns but lost control in steep dives. Against the new P-38 Lightning, it couldn't keep up in acceleration or climb. Against the P-40 Warhawk, it matched maneuverability but lost in speed and durability. The conclusions were clear. The Zero's reign was over. It just didn't know it yet. By early 1943, the training manuals included entire sections labeled Combat against the A6M0. Pilots memorized its weaknesses as if studying for an exam. They knew its roll rate, its climb time, its stall behavior. Even its left-turn preference was common knowledge. Veteran ace John Thatch, the man behind the weave, summed it up best. The Zero was a beautiful airplane, but we stopped fighting its fight. We learned to fight ours. That shift, from fear to understanding, changed everything. A few months earlier, American squadrons had avoided engagement. Now, they hunted. The Zero that once symbolized Japanese air superiority had unwittingly become its undoing. And while the fighter sat quietly in a California hangar, its lessons were echoing across thousands of miles of ocean, reshaping the Pacific Air War one dogfight at a time. By the beginning of 1943, the Akatan Zero was no longer just a captured airplane, it was a teacher. Its frame had become the blueprint for understanding the enemy's philosophy, and its lessons were spreading through every corner of American aviation. At North Island Naval Air Station, engineers, designers, and test pilots walked around the sleek silver machine like archaeologists examining a relic of another civilization. Every rivet, every wire, every screw told a story of decisions made for one purpose: lightness above all else. Grumman's engineering team, already working on the F-6F Hellcat, studied the Zero's measurements with great interest. The new aircraft had been conceived as a sturdier, more powerful replacement for the Wildcat, but now its purpose took on new urgency. The Zero's test results confirmed what American designers had suspected but could now quantify. The enemy's dominance relied on fragility. All they needed to do was design the opposite, a fighter that could absorb damage, overpower its opponent, and live to fight another day. In February, Grumman's first prototype Hellcat rolled out for testing. With its massive 2,000 horsepower engine, thick armor plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks, it was the antithesis of the Zero. Where the Japanese plane relied on elegance, the Hellcat relied on brute endurance. It was heavier, slower to turn, but immensely powerful. When test pilots pushed it into dives, the airframe barely flinched. They could redline the throttle without worrying about structural failure. When the two aircraft, the captured Zero and the new Hellcat, were flown against each other in mock combat, the contrast was stunning. The Zero could circle gracefully at low speeds, but the Hellcat dictated the engagement. It climbed faster, dove steeper, and rolled with force the Zero couldn't match. When the Hellcat hit, it hit like a hammer. The days of running were over. Meanwhile, American training programs transformed completely. Instead of focusing on turn-based dogfights, instructors emphasized energy tactics, the art of using altitude, speed, and momentum to attack and escape. The term boom and zoom became standard vocabulary. Pilots were trained not to imitate the Zero style, but to use its weaknesses against it. The light Japanese fighter couldn't dive fast without losing control, and its carburetor still cut fuel flow during negative G-forces. Americans learned to exploit those vulnerabilities like clockwork. In the spring of 1943, new recruits arriving at airfields from California to Hawaii studied diagrams of the Zero's internal structure. The once secret Japanese weapon was now part of American textbooks. Its vulnerabilities, the lack of armor, the exposed fuel system, the fragile control surfaces, were not only known but practiced against in training. And yet, despite its weaknesses, the Zero's influence remained profound. American engineers couldn't help but admire its simplicity. It had achieved a level of efficiency that was, in its own way, brilliant. Every decision made sense within its own context, the belief that the best defense was to never be hit. That mindset, however, was rooted in an assumption that Japan's war would be short and decisive. But by mid-1943, it was clear the war would be anything but short. The Pacific Theater had become a battle of endurance, factories, fuel, and replacement pilots. In such a war, survivability mattered more than perfection. Every pilot who returned home carried experience that made the next mission easier. Every aircraft that could take a hit and still land safely meant another day of knowledge gained. The Zero, by contrast, offered no second chances. Its pilots flew brilliantly but had no margin for error. A single bullet to the wrong spot could ignite a fire or shatter the unarmored cockpit. As American aircraft improved, the difference became devastating. When the F-6F Hellcat entered full service later that year, the shift in the air was immediate. American pilots who once prayed to survive now hunted with confidence. The Hellcat's armor and power allowed them to fight on their own terms. They could dive, strike, and climb away before the Zero even had time to react. The same sky that had once belonged to Japan was slowly becoming American territory. And behind that transformation stood one unlikely source, a single abandoned Zero pulled from a frozen Alaskan marsh. But the story of the Akutan Zero wasn't over. The aircraft itself still had work to do, not in battle, but in classrooms and training ranges across the United States. As it continued to fly, it would prepare hundreds of American pilots for the war that lay ahead, and for the decisive encounters that would determine the fate of the Pacific. By the summer of 1943, the captured Zero had become more than just a static exhibit or an engineering specimen. It was a living classroom. At Naval Air Station North Island, test pilots continued flying it regularly, comparing its behavior against every American aircraft then in service. Pilots lined up to fly mock engagements against it, hungry to understand the legend firsthand. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders and his fellow testers developed a training schedule that soon spread throughout the Navy. The idea was simple. The best way to defeat the Zero was to fight it, safely, under controlled conditions. So, each week, pilots took turns engaging the Akutan Zero in mock dogfights, each encounter carefully observed, filmed, and dissected. The first thing every pilot noticed was how graceful the Zero felt. At low speeds, it turned with an almost hypnotic fluidity, responding instantly to the smallest touch of the stick. Its wings sliced through the air like a dancer's arms, curving effortlessly through maneuvers that heavier American fighters couldn't match. For a few seconds, it was easy to understand how the Japanese had gained their terrifying early advantage. But the illusion always broke. When the mock fights escalated to higher speeds, the Zero's elegance betrayed it. The control stick began to resist movement, its ailerons froze at speeds above 200 knots, and its once effortless agility turned to sluggish strain. Pilots in Wildcats and Warhawks found themselves pulling away easily in dives, then climbing back to strike before the Zero could react. What had once been a nightmare now looked like a puzzle with the solution written in plain sight. After each session, Sanders gathered the pilots in the hangar to debrief. They'd spread diagrams across tables, pointing out where the Zero failed and where it excelled. At 10,000 feet, she's king, one pilot would say. But push her to 300 knots, and she's a sitting duck. Another would add, she turns left like she's on rails, but force her right, and she slows to a crawl. These notes were passed to training commands across the Pacific, and from there, to every frontline squadron. By late 1943, the Navy's new fighter pilots arrived at their units already knowing how to counter the Zero. They knew to dive instead of turn, to stay fast instead of fancy, and to avoid the close-range turning duels that had doomed so many of their predecessors. The transformation was astonishing. Within months, the kill ratios began shifting. The US Navy and Marine Corps went from losing aircraft in 2-to-1 ratios early in the war to achieving overwhelming superiority. By mid-1943, reports from the Solomon Islands and New Guinea showed that American fighters were now winning engagements by margins of 5-to-1, and rising. The lessons of the Akatan Zero were paying off, not in laboratories or test hangars, but in the open skies over the Pacific. But the greatest change wasn't mechanical, it was psychological. The Zero's mystique had been broken. The aircraft that once symbolized invincibility was now seen as beatable, predictable, even fragile. It's fast, it's clever, one Hellcat pilot told a reporter, but it's made of paper. Confidence returned to American squadrons in a way that hadn't been felt since before Pearl Harbor. In one of the mock training sessions at North Island, an instructor jokingly wrote on the hangar wall, "Know your Zero. Fear not the Zero." It became an unofficial motto among carrier squadrons, passed down from pilot to pilot. Meanwhile, the Akatan Zero itself was starting to show its age. Hundreds of flight hours, constant disassembly, and reassembly for testing had worn down its fragile structure. Mechanics noticed fine cracks along the wing roots and small tears in the fabric of its control surfaces. But even in its decline, the plane continued to teach. Every dent and scratch became another data point, another lesson in how this machine, and by extension, the enemy who built it, thought. To many of the mechanics who worked on it, the Zero became almost human. They referred to it affectionately as she, talked to it as they tightened bolts, and guarded it as if it were a national secret, which, in a sense, it was. Few aircraft in history had ever yielded so much information from so small a wreck. By the end of 1943, the Zero was grounded for extensive maintenance, but its mission was complete. The data gathered from it had already spread through the fleet, shaping every engagement from Guadalcanal to the Gilbert Islands. And as the war continued, the lessons learned from that fragile airframe would ripple outward, influencing not only how Americans fought, but how they built. The captured fighter from a lonely Alaskan marsh had changed the way an entire nation thought about war in the air. Its next chapter would be written not by test pilots or engineers, but by the new generation of American aviators who took those lessons into battle and never looked back. By early 1944, the skies over the Pacific were no longer the domain of the Zero. What had once been a symbol of fear and domination was now a relic of a fading strategy. The transformation wasn't gradual, it was explosive. Within a year, the lessons learned from the Akatan Zero had translated into overwhelming American control of the air. When the F-6F Hellcat entered full operational use, it was as though the entire balance of air combat had shifted overnight. Built like a flying fortress compared to the fragile Japanese fighter, the Hellcat could take damage, dive harder, and climb faster. Pilots who once prayed to survive a dogfight were now confident hunters. The Hellcat wasn't as elegant as the Zero, but in war, elegance meant little when faced with 2,000 horsepower and an armored cockpit. In the early months of 1944, carrier-based squadrons began launching large-scale raids across the Pacific. Over the Marshall Islands, Truk Lagoon, and the Marianas, American aircraft swarmed the skies in numbers the Japanese had never seen before. And among those pilots, Nearly everyone had studied the Zero's weaknesses, memorizing its behavior down to the smallest detail. Reports from combat zones read like test notes come to life. Pilots described seeing Zeros try to outturn them, only to stall midair or lose control in a dive. "They're still flying like it's 1941, one pilot wrote after a mission over Truk. "We know every move before they make it." The Japanese Air Force, still fielding thousands of Zero fighters, faced a nightmare of its own creation. The very qualities that had made the Zero brilliant at the start of the war, its agility, its range, its light frame, were now liabilities. Every encounter became a battle of endurance the Zero couldn't survive. The Hellcat, the Corsair, and the Lightning all exploited the same principle: speed and strength over grace. The Corsair, with its inverted gull wings and massive engine, could outclimb and outgun the Zero with ease. Pilots nicknamed it the bent-wing bird, and to the enemy, it was a predator unlike anything they had faced before. Even when Japanese pilots managed to hit an American plane, the results were discouraging. Armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that a single bullet rarely caused serious damage. Meanwhile, American rounds tore through the Zero's thin skin like paper. Pilots returning from missions reported seeing enemy aircraft burst apart after just a few hits. But the biggest difference lay not in metal, but in manpower. The Japanese could no longer replace their pilots at the rate they were being lost. Years of combat had drained their pool of experienced aviators, leaving cockpits filled with trainees barely out of flight school. The Americans, by contrast, were producing hundreds of new, well-trained pilots every month, all trained on the principles that had come from that one captured Zero. The results were devastatingly one-sided. During the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944, more than 300 Japanese aircraft were lost in a single day, most of them Zeros. American losses barely reached double digits. Pilots who participated described the battle as surreal, like target practice in the sky. "They came straight at us," one pilot recalled, "and every time we turned, they were gone." The Akutan Zero's legacy was everywhere in that victory. The tactics that shredded Japan's air power were the same ones born from its analysis: stay fast, stay high, never turn with a Zero, dive and climb in waves. The aircraft that once ruled the Pacific had inadvertently written the script for its own downfall. Back in the United States, the original Akutan Zero sat quietly in a hangar, its once shiny fuselage dulled by time and test flights. It had flown its last mission months earlier, but its influence still soared across the ocean every time a Hellcat or Corsair lifted off a carrier deck. Mechanics who had worked on the aircraft would sometimes visit it, standing in silence beside its wings, realizing how strange its journey had been, from enemy weapon to ally teacher. The wreck that had been discovered by accident in the lonely hills of Alaska had become one of the most consequential finds of the entire war. But the Zero story still held one final twist, because even as it faded from dominance, Japan was already trying to replace it. Engineers back home were designing newer, faster models to reclaim their edge. What they didn't know was that the Zero's greatest lesson had already spread far beyond its wings. It had taught the world the importance of balance between speed and safety, agility and endurance, offense and defense. And that balance would define the next generation of air combat, a future the Zero itself would never see. By late 1944, Japan's engineers were racing against time. The Zero, once hailed as the ultimate fighter, was now hopelessly outclassed. In every engagement, from the Philippines to Iwo Jima, American aircraft were faster, tougher, and flown by better trained pilots. Still, the Imperial Navy refused to abandon the dream of regaining air superiority. New designs rolled out of hangars across Japan: the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, the Kawanishi N1K Shiden, and even early jet experiments, each meant to replace the aging Zero and restore pride to Japanese aviation. But none of these projects could solve the underlying problem. Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing. Allied bombing campaigns had crippled factories, disrupted supply chains, and cut off the flow of critical materials like aluminum and aviation fuel. What few aircraft Japan did manage to produce arrive half-finished or assembled under emergency conditions, with inexperienced workers and improvised parts. Even the most promising prototypes never reached full production. Meanwhile, American aircraft production was running at an unimaginable scale. Factories in California, Texas, and Michigan rolled out thousands of planes every month. The same industrial philosophy that had powered Detroit's automobile industry was now fueling the war. Every nut, bolt, and rivet was standardized, every process designed for speed. The lessons of the Akutan Zero had been fully absorbed: simplicity, accessibility, and quantity over perfection. The result was a fleet that could fight forever. The US Navy's carriers operated like floating cities, launching hundreds of planes daily. Replacement aircraft arrived before the old ones were even written off. What Japan lost in a single week could take months to replace, a gap that no amount of courage could close. On the front lines, Japanese pilots quickly realized their new machines couldn't change fate. The Raiden, though fast, had poor range. The Shiden was agile but plagued by mechanical failures. Many never reached the battlefield at all. By contrast, the Hellcat and Corsair were now joined by the P-51 Mustang and the B-29 Superfortress, machines that represented the peak of modern aviation. Every encounter in the sky told the same story: the end of the Zeros era. The once feared fighter that had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 was now a ghost, flown by young recruits with only a few dozen hours of training. American pilots, trained relentlessly and armed with superior technology, treated the Zero with professional respect but no longer with fear. They were brave, one Marine Corsair pilot later recalled, but the war had passed them by. As the tide turned, the Zero itself became a kind of tragic symbol, not of victory, but of brilliance undone by circumstance. It represented Japan's finest engineering, but also its greatest miscalculation, the belief that skill and design could overcome scale and supply. The same philosophy that had built the Zero, precision, minimal weight, delicate performance, was now destroying it. In the air, the difference was visual. When American fighters and bombers crossed the skies, they moved in endless formations, supported by radar, carriers, and coordinated command. Japanese interceptors appeared in small, scattered groups, operating without communication, often flying until their tanks ran dry. Even when Japan's new aircraft did meet the enemy, they faced a system, not just a machine. The Americans had built an entire ecosystem of logistics: fuel ships, repair crews, replacement parts, and radar-guided coordination that turned every battle into a calculated equation. The Zero, by contrast, belonged to a world where individual heroism still tried to stand against industrial reality. On the ground, Japan's factories echoed the same story. Workers reused scrap metal from wrecked aircraft. Engineers experimented with wooden frames and substitute alloys. It was desperate ingenuity, creative, but futile. Meanwhile, in California, production lines continued 24 hours a day, fueled by electricity, automation, and endless resources. The contrast was absolute. Where one nation was running out of material, the other was running out of warehouse space to store its surplus. And yet, through all this decline, the Zero never fully disappeared. It remained in service until the very end, flown by pilots who refused to give up. For them, it wasn't just an airplane, it was a symbol of what Japan once was. They knew its weaknesses, its limitations, but they still took off into the sky, believing that mastery of flight could overcome the odds. They were wrong, but they were also unforgettable. Every Zero that rose into the air in 1945 was a ghost from an earlier war, graceful, fragile, and hopelessly outmatched, but unwilling to fade quietly. By 1945, the once proud silhouette of the Zero was no longer a symbol of dominance but of desperation. The war had turned into a struggle Japan could no longer sustain. Cities lay in ruins, airfields were craters of dust, and fuel, the lifeblood of any air force, had become a luxury measured in droplets. Yet still, the Zeros flew. They were no longer the sleek predators of 1941. Many were stripped down, patched together survivors from earlier battles, their engines coughing on low-grade fuel, their once smooth surfaces scarred and patched. Pilots took off knowing that each flight might be their last, not because of enemy fire, but because they might not have the fuel to return. In those final months, Japan's leadership redefined the purpose of the Zero. It was no longer a machine of tactical superiority, it was a vessel of sacrifice. The aircraft that had once embodied agility and grace was now repurposed for one final, grim role, as part of the special attack units. Young pilots, barely trained, were ordered to fly their aircraft into enemy ships in missions that reflected both desperation and devotion. The transformation of the Zero into this new role shocked even some within the Imperial Navy. Engineers who had designed it for precision and maneuverability watched in silence as their creation became a tool of hopeless defiance. One mechanic later recalled, "It was never meant for that. It was meant to dance, not to fall." To the Americans, these missions were terrifying but also telling. They revealed how far Japan's air power had fallen, from innovation to improvisation, from mastery to martyrdom. Radar networks, carrier defenses, and disciplined gunners ensured that most of these final flights ended before they could reach their targets. Yet, each one carried the weight of a nation unwilling to surrender to industrial inevitability. Meanwhile, the skies above the Pacific were ruled entirely by American aircraft. Fleets of B-29 Superfortresses crossed Japan daily, flying higher and faster than any Zero could reach. Escorting them were waves of long-range P-51 Mustangs, which swept the skies clean before the bombers even arrived. Against such power, the few remaining Zeros could do little. On the ground, American pilots began encountering captured or abandoned Japanese aircraft, much as the Germans had once examined Allied machines in Europe. They noticed how light the Zero still was, how refined its construction seemed, and yet how outdated it had become. It was like stepping into another era, one test pilot said after inspecting a captured example. You could see the brilliance, but you could also see the limits. By this point, American design had evolved beyond the Zero's philosophy. Aircraft like the Mustang and the Hellcat represented a new generation, faster, stronger, and designed for endurance rather than elegance. They could fly thousands of miles, take massive punishment, and still return to base. The lessons learned from the Akutan Zero had been absorbed, improved, and scaled into a system that could outlast any single battle. In the final months of the war, as American fleets closed in on the Japanese home islands, the contrast between the two nations' approaches became absolute. Japan's airfields were lined with aging Zeros, many without engines, used for spare parts or camouflage. In contrast, American carriers had so many planes that some were stored below deck simply because there wasn't room to park them all. The Zero's last flights were often solitary, brief bursts of flight from remote bases, chasing formations they could no longer reach. Pilots who once ruled the skies now looked up at endless waves of bombers blotting out the sun. There was no sky left for us, one surviving Japanese aviator later recalled. It belonged to someone else. Yet even in defeat, the Zero left behind something that couldn't be measured in victories or losses. It had reshaped the way nations thought about air warfare. The Americans had learned to simplify and mass-produce. The British had learned to innovate within constraints. And even Japan, though broken, had learned a lesson that would shape its post-war rebirth, that perfection without scale was a dream that could not survive reality. When Japan finally announced its surrender in August 1945, a handful of Zeros still sat quietly in hangars across the country. Some were half disassembled, others hidden away by pilots who couldn't bear to destroy them. They were relics of another time, symbols not just of what had been lost, but of how far aviation had come in just a few years. On one airfield outside Tokyo, a group of mechanics gathered around a weathered Zero as American forces arrived. They didn't speak. They simply stood in silence, watching as the last aircraft of their youth was inspected by men who had once been their enemies. The war was over, but the lessons, from Alaska to the Pacific, were only beginning. When peace finally came, the skies over the Pacific grew silent. The carriers, the formations, the endless trails of vapor, all faded into history. But in museums, hangars, and old photographs, one aircraft remained a haunting presence, the Mitsubishi A6M0. Once the embodiment of dominance, it now stood as a quiet reminder of how swiftly power can change hands. In the years immediately after the war, American engineers and historians continued to study every surviving fragment of the Zero. Some of the aircraft captured intact were shipped to the United States, their aluminum skins dull with age, their engines carefully disassembled for analysis. At research bases in California and Maryland, test pilots flew these machines under controlled conditions, comparing them to the very fighters that had defeated them. The verdict was always the same: admiration mixed with astonishment. The Zero's lightness, its responsiveness, its elegant construction, all of it was still extraordinary. Even years later, pilots spoke of it as an aircraft that felt alive under the hands. It flew like a thought, one American pilot said after a post-war test flight. You only had to imagine a move, and it was already happening. But alongside that admiration came a sobering understanding. The same qualities that made it brilliant had also sealed its fate. The absence of armor, the lack of fuel protection, the fragile frame, they weren't mistakes, but choices. Choices born from a philosophy that valued offense above survival, victory above endurance. In a short war, that might have been enough. But in a long one, it became fatal. For Japan, the lessons were profound. In the years of rebuilding that followed, engineers who had once designed for war turned their skills to peace. Many of the same minds who had worked on the Zero would go on to build Japan's first civilian aircraft, and later, the advanced technologies that powered the country's economic revival. The same precision, the same obsession with performance, were still there, but now they were guided by a new philosophy: endurance, safety, and sustainability. In a sense, the Zero became the origin point of Japan's post-war transformation. It was both a symbol of the past and a lesson for the future, proof that innovation without resilience was a path to ruin. Museums across the world now preserve surviving examples of the aircraft, not as trophies, but as artifacts of human ambition and tragedy. Each rivet, each panel, tells a story not just of engineering, but of perspective, of how a nation once viewed the sky. For historians, the capture of the Akitan Zero remains one of the most significant moments of the Second World War. It didn't win a single battle by itself, but it shifted the balance of all that followed. Its discovery in the fog of an Alaskan island revealed not just the design of an airplane, but the soul of an opposing philosophy. One side believed in grace, the other in grit. And in the end, endurance proved the greater weapon. Today, when visitors walk through aviation museums and stop before the smooth white wings of the Zero, they often see it as something almost poetic, a machine that was too perfect for the world it was born into. The simplicity of its lines, the quiet beauty of its shape, and the tragedy of its history combine into a single, unforgettable presence. It is no longer an instrument of war, but a mirror reflecting the choices that shaped an era. Somewhere in that story still lives the memory of a 19-year-old pilot named Tadayoshi Koga, whose routine mission over Alaska changed the course of history. His flight ended in an isolated marsh, yet what followed became one of the great turning points of the Pacific War. From his aircraft came the data, the tactics, and the insight that saved countless lives and reshaped the balance of power. He never knew it, but through that single accident, his machine became a teacher for the enemy, and, ultimately, a teacher for the world. In the end, the story of the Zero is not simply one of victory or defeat. It is the story of design philosophy meeting reality, of ideals colliding with endurance. It is a reminder that brilliance alone is not enough, that even the most perfect idea must face the test of time, material, and consequence. And so, decades later, when the morning sun reflects off a preserved Zero's wings, it shines not on a relic of conquest, but on a lesson, the lesson that power without protection, speed without sustainability, and pride without perspective are all destined to fall. The Zero began as a weapon of war. It ended as a monument to understanding. And in that transformation lies one of the most powerful stories ever to emerge from the skies.